Pasamos a la segunda conferencia a cargo del señor Alan Marshall. El señor Alan Marshall es el presidente de la Asociación Europea de Museos de la Imprenta. Es escritor y debido a los libros que ha publicado sobre la imprenta, le han nombrado en Francia Chevalier Caballero de las Artes y de las Letras. Es escocés de nacimiento, francés, porque vive desde hace muchos años en Francia, y fue anteriormente también director del Museo de Lyon, que es donde yo le conocí hace unos años, cuando organizó un magnífico simposio con el señor Moirot, que había sido, junto con Igonet, el inventor de la primera máquina de fotocomposición comercial. Pues a Monsieur Alan Marshall, por favor.
Bona tarda. With that, I'm ashamed to say I've exhausted my knowledge of the Catalan language, and I couldn't do any better in Spanish. So I'm going to speak to you in English. Perhaps, if I may, before I start, I would just like to thank the organisers of Gutenberg 2018, and in particular Wolfgang Hartmann and Bauer Type, for their very kind invitation to come and talk to you this evening about Gutenberg's heritage. It's both an honour and a pleasure for me to talk about Gutenberg's heritage in the Design Museum of Barcelona. On visiting it this morning, on discovering it this morning, it suddenly occurred to me that what I'm going to say might come as some kind of a distant echo to the immense effort which must have gone into the creation of this absolutely superb museum. Before getting into my subject, I should perhaps make a couple of apologies. First of all, for my Scottish accent, which 35 years in France has done nothing to get rid of, and which I hope won't cause the English speakers among you too much difficulty. And perhaps more seriously, an apology for the fact that I won't actually be saying much about Gutenberg. Rather, what I'd like to do is to look at Gutenberg's heritage through the prism of printing museums by offering a rapid overview of how and why museums and other organizations dedicated to printing heritage first came into existence, and how they've developed since the middle of the 19th century. Or if I could put it rather more simply, what I'd like to do is look at how printing left the workshop and found its way into the museum. The story begins with the book which is a long tradition. I should think of using this little machine. Voilà. The story begins with a book which has a long tradition of being considered an object of value because of its intellectual and symbolic content, an object to be preserved, valued, transmitted from one generation to the next. Over the centuries, considerable prestige has been accorded to certain categories of books. Those which were esteemed for their content, for their beauty, or in some cases simply for having been owned at some point by an eminent personality. It was only in the 19th century, however, that the book came to be valued as a form of cultural heritage in something like the modern sense of the term. The process by which printing and its products have become heritage is closely linked to the progressive diversification of the forms and function of printed documents. The process began with books and prints, traditionally considered to be the noblest of printed products. It continued with newspapers and the periodical press, which first appeared in the 17th century, followed by a multitude of administrative and commercial documents, which we generally associate with the spread of industrialization, bureaucracy, and advertising. And the process continues today with what we now call graphic communication, an activity which goes far beyond traditional forms of printing and paper, but which, in the digital age, is their natural extension. Over the years, the progressive enlargement of the field of graphic heritage has expressed itself through the creation of institutions dedicated to the preservation, study, and exhibition of artifacts related to printing and to printed products. Among these institutions, we naturally find printing museums, but we also find other types of organizations, such as libraries with rare book departments, archives, university special collections, heritage workshops, and a wide variety of museums who happen to find themselves with a significant number of print-related objects in their collections. The diversity of printing heritage organizations is in its turn reflected in the many scientific disciplines which underpin their activities. Disciplines which define what should or should not be considered as printing heritage, and which determine how the history of graphic communication is written and narrated in these various institutions. A selection of these disciplines would naturally include the history of printing, which has often been written by printers themselves. It would include bibliography and book history, disciplines which, as their names suggest, concentrate on the book. Our list would include the history of art, which generally concerns itself only with the more remarkable forms of graphic production. And still among the more traditional disciplines, it would include newspaper history, a field which has been largely dominated by political, social, and economic historians. More modern disciplines would include the history of graphic design, which developed rapidly in the second half of the 20th century, the history of communication, which was largely the product of the spectacular growth of audiovisual media, and most recently of all, we would find information history, which, having incorporated the history of libraries and the history of computing, now lays claim to a vast field which includes graphic communication. To come back to the question of how the eminently practical activity of printing carved out a place for itself in the rarefied world of heritage and museums, the process began in earnest in the middle of the 19th century, a time when printing heritage was confined largely to a small circle of connoisseurs and collectors, bibliophiles who were to all intents and purposes the only people who actually had access to the private libraries where at the time printing heritage was to be found. At the beginning of the 19th century, the idea of exhibiting books and prints was largely unknown. During the 17th and 18th centuries, some printed products were to be found tentatively displayed in cabinets of curiosities. And here we see an 18th century engraving of a cabinet of curiosities showing books displayed alongside other curiosities, such as stuffed animals, fossils, geological specimens, and scientific instruments. Books and prints were also displayed at an early date in the first so-called public museums, access to which was in reality at that time limited to a very select public. Up until the mid-19th century, however, books and prints, when they were displayed, were not generally displayed as such, as books. Rather, they were exhibited to illustrate points of history, scientific discoveries, historical monuments and topographical features, or to illustrate the life and work of famous personalities of the past. one of the very first public museums in which books were displayed as books, that is to say, for their inherent qualities as objects, was the Meermanno Museum, which was founded in The Hague in the Netherlands in 1852. The Meermanno was the brainchild of a rich bibliophile who bequeathed his collection of 15,000 rare books to the Dutch state on condition that it form the basis of a public museum to be installed in his mansion house, which he also left to the state. Other museums followed, such as the Planten Moretus Museum in Antwerp in 1877, which had been the home and workshop of the celebrated 16th century printer Christopher Planten and his successors, and whose printing equipment, library, and mansion house had survived largely intact until the late 19th century, when it was acquired and turned into a museum by the city of Antwerp. And most famously, the Gutenberg Museum, which opened its doors in Mainz in 1900. The Gutenberg Museum owed its existence and its collections to a series of commemorations of the celebrated inventor, which were organized in the course of the 19th century, and also to the active participation of the local city library and of the German printing trade. A significant development during this period was the inclusion in some of these early printing museums of the tools of the trade and the techniques of printing, alongside the more traditional books and prints. The Enschede Museum, for example, which we see here, opened in Haarlem in 1904. It took its name from the commercial printing firm to which it belonged. The firm's historic collections covered several centuries of printing in the Netherlands from all points of view, but with a particular emphasis on technical aspects. The first book and printing museums were set up in a favorable context. The Industrial Revolution was in full spate, and printing reigned supreme as the foremost means of communication. What better time to celebrate and legitimize the first mass media in history? The 19th century was also the time of the construction of nation states, and it's perhaps no surprise that the history of books and printing was pressed into the service of the construction of national identity and prestige by way of celebrations and commemorations of major inventions and important personalities. Personalities such as Lawrence Koster, who had been claimed by the Netherlands as the inventor of printing from movable type, a place which he subsequently lost to Gutenberg, whose memory was repeatedly celebrated in the course of the 19th century. And also William Caxton, who was celebrated throughout the English-speaking world as the first British printer. In such celebrations and commemorations, political, religious, and social considerations were never very far away. And here we see the British Prime Minister, Gladstone, opening the great Caxton exhibition of 1877, a national celebration which, incidentally, served the cause of the Church of England through a major exhibition of Protestant Bibles. In the second half of the 19th century, interest in antiquarian books was encouraged by the growth of the market for rare books and bibliophile editions, which spawned a new generation of publications dedicated to book collecting and aimed at the general public. It was also encouraged by the creation of a large number of public libraries, which were often involved in the organization of the earliest temporary exhibitions of books. Here we see the reading room of the municipal library, which was built in Grenoble in the late 19th century, designed with facilities for small exhibitions in the main reading room, aimed at regular readers and showing items of particular interest from their collections. Interest in rare books was also encouraged by the rapid development of the science of bibliography. Originally a rather technical discipline based on close study of the typography and modes of production of 15th and 16th century books, it became increasingly open towards the end of the century to social and economic aspects of the production, distribution, and reception of books. Bibliography made a decisive contribution to the development of both printing and book history. Again, considerations of national prestige were not far away, because a large part of the bibliographer's job in the 19th century was to resolve the many problems which were raised by the identification of the works of the earliest national printers, or by the problems raised by particularly important publications, such as, in the United Kingdom, the first editions of the works of Shakespeare, which had a particularly complex publishing history. Moving on into the first half of the 20th century, new museums related to printing continued to appear, but not yet in large numbers. For that, we have to await the closing decades of the century. For the printing industry, on the other hand, this was a period of rapid growth and far-reaching technological innovation. It was also in the opening years of the 20th century, in the face of an increasing diversity of printed products, that the book ceased definitively to be the economic and aesthetic motor of the printing industry. With the rise of industrial capitalism and bureaucracy, the volume of administrative and commercial information was increasing exponentially, as was its mobility. New ways had to be found to compile and archive information, to share it through ever denser networks of individuals and services within administrations and enterprises. The form of the book was clearly not adapted to such fluidity of information. The result was the emergence of a print culture based on modular, free-moving documents which could be communicated, shared, compiled, archived, retrieved in constantly changing configurations. Administrative documents required to inform and regulate an ever more complex and urbanized society. Commercial and administrative documents to cope with the increasing scale of industrial and managerial capitalism's operations. Advertising and packaging, which were the corollary of industrial production, mass marketing, and the emergence of the consumer economy. The immediate consequence of the increasing volume and variety of administrative and commercial documents was the emergence of what we now call the graphic designer. For it had become more and more difficult for a single firm and for traditionally trained typographers to master the visual codes, styles, functionalities of an increasingly fragmented market. As printing firms focused on specific sectors of an ever-expanding market, so a new generation of typographers emerged to meet their needs. Specialists in book design, magazine design, advertising and packaging, or the conception of increasingly complex technical and administrative documents. In heritage terms, the first manifestation of this shift in the center of gravity of graphic production away from books was the creation of newspaper museums, such as the Pers Museum in Amsterdam in 1902, or the one we see here, the Musée International de la Presse in Brussels in 1907. A further step towards the acceptance of a broader approach to printing heritage by museums came from a rather unexpected quarter, from the wave of poster mania which swept Europe at the turn of the century. Up until then, art historians had interested themselves only in certain selected, not to say select, forms of graphic production such as prints and printmaking, book illustration, or decorated book bindings. Art history had, of course, taken on questions of art and industry since the middle of the 19th century, but it had so far paid little, if any, attention to industrial printing and publishing. The turn of the century, however, saw the first temporary exhibitions of illustrated lithographic posters, which, unlike most printed publicity, which remained firmly ignored, quickly became objects of collection, a merchandise whose value was closely linked with the reputation and market rating of the best-known poster artists, many of whom were already present in the art market. Collectors also played an important role in extending the field of printing heritage. In the opening years of the 20th century, they were increasingly numerous, and inevitably, a small number of pioneers began to expand their collections to include new types of document, in particular, the products of jobbing printing, of what in heritage terms we now call printed ephemera. Those everyday documents which, though considered by the majority of collectors at the time to be lacking any real interest, were already greatly appreciated as sources of information by social, political, and economic historians. In general, however, printed ephemera was largely ignored, including by historians of printing and typography during this period. Rare were those who considered general commercial printing as being essential to a proper understanding of the history of graphic communication. And it was only in the 1960s that printed ephemera began to be studied systematically by historians of typography and graphic design. The gradual broadening of the scope of private and later public collections of non-book printed materials, which had begun discreetly in the 19th century and which accelerated in the first half of the 20th century, would not find its full expression in the exhibitions of museums and libraries until the closing decades of the 20th century. Moving on again, in the wake of the Second World War, the printing industry entered a period of reconstruction and modernization after several years of war and penury. As a media, print was still predominant, both from an industrial and from a cultural point of view, resisting the encroachments of cinema, radio, and more recently, television. Storm clouds were, however, beginning to gather on the horizon. Photographic type composition, electronics, and the still newfangled computers augured important changes to come, though the impact of these changes was as yet impossible to discern with any great precision. The printing trade was already beginning to talk about the end of hot metal, and the media, as Wolfgang remarked, were even evoking the death of Gutenberg, no less. The ever more important role which advertising agencies and graphic designers were coming to play within the industry also suggested that the traditional identity of the printing trade was under threat. During the post-war period, the number of new printing and related museums increased significantly. Most of these new printing museums were dedicated directly or indirectly to the celebration of print's glorious past and to its most prestigious products. The Klingspor Museum, for example, which opened in Offenbach in Germany in 1953, was dedicated to the art of the book. The Museo Bodoniano, which opened in Parma in 1963, celebrated the work of the Italian typographer Giambattista Bodoni. And the Musée de l'Imprimerie et de la Banque in Lyon in 1964 told the story of printing's contribution to the progress of French culture and civilization. Local traditions were also represented, with the creation of museums dedicated to special sectors of print production, such as playing cards or textile printing. The post-war period was also one of intense activity on the part of print and book historians, with the publication of a spate of important works on the history of printing and typography. the creation of learned societies, like the Printing Historical Society in the United Kingdom, and the stirring of serious interest in vernacular design and typography in the form of printed ephemera. We now come to the 1980s and 90s, which, in contrast to the first century of printing and book museums, these 2 decades were marked by a veritable flood of new museums, many of which were dedicated to preserving the memory of trades and techniques which were in the process of disappearing from the industrial landscape, or which had already disappeared. Such a remarkable increase in the number of new museums was no accident, and was the product of a period of technological change, the like of which had never before been seen in the printing industry. By the end of the 1960s, offset printing had already captured a large part of the market. Then, in the late 1970s and the 1980s, the graphic industries were radically transformed by the massive eruption of electronics and computers. With the advent in quick succession of computer typesetting, desktop publishing, and digital networks and media, the printing trade began to fully realize that the techniques of printing from metal type were finished, and that a generation of printers was in danger of totally disappearing, lock, stock, and barrel, with their skills and knowledge. Suddenly, it had become vitally urgent to preserve the traditional techniques and skills which now had no place within the printing industry. Printing museums began to spring up everywhere. The collections of these new museums came from all sorts of sources, from printing firms modernizing their equipment, printing firms closing down because they'd been unable to keep up with technical change, or as collections put together by former members of the trade. And as luck would have it, conditions were relatively favorable to the creation of printing museums. In the 1980s and 90s, public sources of funding were, generally speaking, conducive to initiatives involving the preservation both of the material and of the non-material culture of trades such as printing. Eco-museums, which had become the order of the day, offered municipalities, both large and small, an attractive means of extending their cultural programme, while at the same time valorising local traditions and industries, such as printing. By the turn of the 21st century, libraries were also becoming increasingly aware of the importance of exhibiting and interpreting their collections of books and other graphic artefacts, an activity which, in fact, as we have already seen, goes back to the 19th century, but which had hitherto been largely restricted to big heritage libraries. Archives also, though to a lesser extent, began to develop exhibitions and other forms of mediation in order to bring their collections, often of printed documents, to the attention of a broader public. During this same period, the visibility of printing heritage increased, with the gradual recognition of book history as a legitimate academic discipline. Graphic design history also came to the fore, having liberated itself partly from the influence of art history. As for printing history, it fared rather less well during this period. The integration of printing within the much broader communication industries encouraged many to think that more or less everything had already been said about the history of printing, an impression which was reinforced by the insistence of researchers in the field of information and communication studies on new audiovisual media. Professional graphic arts training programs also finally abandoned any last pretense of being interested in the history of graphic production, which seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of the oncoming digital revolution. Coming up to the present day, how has Gutenberg's heritage fared so far in the 21st century? Despite everything, it has not done too badly in the face of the digital revolution. There have never been as many exhibitions of the techniques and products of printing as there are today, nor in such a diversity of institutions. From incunables to fanzines, from indulgences to soup-tin labels, from woodcuts to digigraphs, and from artists' books to commercial posters, almost every facet of print production seems to have its amateurs, its collectors, and a swathe of more or less patrimonial organizations with an interest in bringing it to the attention of the public. The exhibition and mediation of books and other printed documents are now firmly anchored in the cultural programs of libraries, archives, and university special collections, as well as in those of an increasingly broad spectrum of museums operating in other fields. As for printing museums, it goes more or less without saying that they remain a niche within the cultural marketplace, in no way comparable to the mainstream museums of the fine arts, history, or science and technology. Oops. Excuse me. A look at the distribution of printing and related museums in Europe, however, would suggest that Gutenberg is still far from dead. As can be seen from this interactive map of printing in similar museums, which you can find on the website of the Association of European Printing Museums. That said, the rhythm at which new printing and related museums are being set up has slowed somewhat in recent years. And the reason for the slowdown are several, and not all entirely surprising. One reason is quite simply that, given the number of creations of new museums since the late 1970s, there are fewer and fewer collections waiting to become museums. This situation has been accentuated by the passing of the wave of creations of eco-museums and industrial museums, which had so strongly marked the 1980s and the 1990s, and of course also by the budgetary restrictions which were widely applied in the wake of the collapse of the international financial system in 2008. The slowdown has also coincided with several structural problems which printing museums currently have to face, such as the imminent disappearance of the last generation of printers to have practiced hot metal and lithographic techniques in industrial conditions, and the disappearance of the unwritten skills and knowledge of which they were the last repository. The sustainability of many independent printing museums can also be problematic, as the first generation of printer collectors seeks to transmit its collections, skills and knowledge to its successors and to put their museums on a sound, long-term footing. A final difficulty is that the breadth of disciplines involved in graphic heritage leads to a certain fragmentation among the various actors involved in graphic heritage, who don't always communicate with each other as much as they might. Printing museums and libraries, for example, have many preoccupations in common, but they rarely have the same political masters, and they do not generally share the same administrative space. And the distance between printing museums and archives and university special collections is even greater, despite the many missions which they have in common. Even with graphic design museums, relations are often distant. For it does not generally occur to graphic design museums that they may have something in common with the many printing museums, book museums, and heritage libraries, which have been exhibiting graphic objects for over a century and a half. Equally unfortunately, it has to be said that printing museums generally return the feeling. This seeming indifference is doubtless a reflection of the frontiers which traditionally define academic and historical disciplines, with the result that a lot of work remains to be done to convince the different disciplines and actors involved that they do actually have a lot in common. On the positive side, however, it's worth underlining that throughout Europe, a new generation of graphic design historians is gradually finding its voice in the academic world. Teachers and researchers who often pursue a professional activity, who are conscious of the achievements of past generations of printing historians as precursors in the field which we now call material history, and who are also conscious of the necessity to develop a more open, transdisciplinary approach to the study of graphic communication and printing heritage. Today, the role of printing museums and the conditions under which they pursue their missions are changing. The digital revolution is opening up new perspectives for museums of all kinds. For printing museums, however, the impact of digital technologies goes to the very heart of their subject. Over the last 4 decades, digital technologies have been profoundly altering the very nature of graphic communication, which now extends far beyond the traditional field of printing to include a wide variety of digital media. And to complicate matters further, the dematerialization of all or part of the production process and the products of graphic communication raises a whole new series of questions concerning the identification, conservation, display, and mediation of digital graphic artifacts in museums. So it is perhaps hardly surprising that the traditional world of printing history is finding itself increasingly involved with new disciplines, such as the history of graphic design and the history of information, disciplines which offer new tools for understanding the profound changes which graphic communication has undergone in the course of the 20th century. In the closely related field of book history, the advances made in recent years in establishing national histories have created the conditions for the pursuit of international comparisons, which will provide us with a fuller understanding of the ways in which the production, distribution, and consumption of printed texts and images have influenced every aspect of human activity over the centuries, crossing and recrossing geographical, political, and cultural borders. The opening up of new perspectives for the preservation and mediation of graphic heritage create new opportunities as well as new challenges for printing museums, who must constantly re-evaluate the nature and the perimeter of their collections and the ways in which they are exhibited and interpreted if they are to transmit Gutenberg's heritage to future generations. Gracias. Merci. Thank you for your attention.